Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a realm where reality intertwines with the inexplicable, where the boundaries of reason dissolve into the shadows of uncertainty. Welcome to the political twilight zone. I am your guide through this enigmatic labyrinth, where politics and power take on life of their own. In this dimension, the threads of truth weave a tapestry of intrigue, challenging our perception of the world we thought we knew. In this world, nothing is as it seems, and the truth lies buried beneath layers of deceit. Prepare to venture where reason meets the unexplained, and where the unexplained might just be. Hi, everybody. We're just finishing up a little. I let the bumper play a little long. For those of you that are, unfortunately, on the podcast, you don't get to hear the bumper music, as I said. We just played a rollicking show tune from the magnificent Sutton Foster, great Broadway talent, singing Anything Goes. So, if you're familiar with that from the play, and it's quite jaunty, and I think it fits very well here. You know, I mean, now heaven knows anything goes. How many times a day does it seem like you think some variation of that? I seem to be thinking it all the time, so it's not unknown. Anyway, thanks a lot for joining us here today. I'm Rick Wagner, getting it here right on KNZZ KGLN at 1100, 92.7. And let's see. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah, the 980 and 101.3. And the internet and podcasts and a couple other things. Thank you for joining us again, as I say. I can't stress enough how much we enjoy your listenership. By the way, you can write me. I always forget that not everybody has my email. You can write me at Rick Wagner, just one word, at mail.com. And I read everything. I don't often get a chance to respond, but I do appreciate it. And I've noticed a drop-off in the hate mail lately, and I don't know why that is. Am I becoming too progressive? Think that might be happening? I don't think so. Anyway, so this week I thought it was something to point out that you people are really living in, an interesting time. Very lucky in some ways, because you're sort of living in a parallel time to 5th century AD Rome, as the Goths were being pushed across the Danube into what was part of the Eastern Roman Empire, which eventually led to Rome being pretty much abandoned, which is very sad. And, it's kind of like the tumbling dice down, and the only thing left standing was Constantinople and that part of the empire. What was happening was, we've discussed a little of this, is that as the people in Rome, in the western part of the empire, became less and less connected with how they got there, and flat wasn't paying any attention to their military, which at its height could arguably be said was perhaps the finest military machine in history. When you take modern weapons out and so forth, just in terms of organization, success, or the whole thing, it's hard to even articulate how different and more effective they were than anybody else during that time. But by the 5th century, nobody thought that was very important anymore, and they just kind of wanted to just live it up down in Rome and the Italian peninsula and stuff, and all this stuff happening across the Danube, and so that's so far away. It'll cost us a lot of money, and we don't want to do it. And besides that, we'll just hire some of these people coming across the Danube, these Goths. And by the way, the Goths were not just coming across as workers. They were coming across as a nation. They were being pushed by the Huns, and so they just came across with everybody. And for a long time, the Romans resisted that, and then they just gave up because it was just too much trouble. They just didn't think it would ever get to them. Well, eventually, things start collapsing because you don't realize that what kept you safe was the legions. And when you let them go and you see how pitiful they were in the 5th century compared to what they would have been in the 2nd, going into the 3rd century, it's really disheartening. And so they began to have more and more incursions into what used to be the Western Empire, what was at that time, until finally some of them were getting into Rome itself, all the way down across the Po Valley and eventually in Rome. And Rome was losing its grasp on being the center of everything because people were leaving as the empire was sort of staggering along, and it was hard to maintain themselves in Rome. When Rome was first sacked, finally, it's hard to even say that, the eternal city being sacked, but their population was perhaps somewhere around 50 to 70,000 people. Now, that sounds like a lot, except if you think that at its peak, Rome had 1 million people. That's a pretty strange thing to have happen. Now, part of that is because the port of Ostia was getting more and more difficult. It's a little ways outside Rome, and it was the port for Rome itself, but it began silting up, and it was became harder and harder for shipping to get into it. And dredging these kinds of things was not something that was very easily done in that time. And on the other side of the peninsula, at Ravenna, which was a pretty big town itself, it was a traditional home of the Roman fleet. They'd come and go from Rome, but Ravenna was better for them, and it was, overlooking the Adriatic. And so they just decided to start moving stuff there. So at one point, they just moved the Roman government there. I don't know how you can keep calling it Rome when you don't, you're not really living in a city, but I guess that was kind of how they did. Remember that the people in Constantinople that were the vestiges of the Roman Empire continued to consider themselves Roman until like the 1400s, early 1400s anyway. And even though the fact that most of them spoke Greek and had little to do with the Italian peninsula at that much, they had still kept some of the culture, a lot of the culture, and kept things going there until finally they sort of succumbed to the same mixture of forces and sort of a dilettante way of approaching their government. That was it. So it's quite a lesson there, and we're sort of living through that now. We have really a large influx across the Rio Grande. Now, the Rio Grande isn't as big a river as the Danube. One of the things about the Danube was it's a big river. It's hard to cross, and so it wasn't like you could come in mass like you can across, say, the Rio Grande. But if you get determined enough, and the people on the other side just aren't up to the task because there's not enough of them, then things like that happen. And what happens when you have that sort of thing happen? Well, pretty soon, as people like to say, all the states become border states because of our transportation system. People can be in the Rio Grande Valley one day, and the next morning, heck, if they take a plane, they can be in New York. Or if they are transported by bus, they can, probably be on their way to Oklahoma City or Tulsa or eventually Denver. And we saw some of the results of that recently. For those of you that saw the video of the Venezuelan gang taking over, well, they, apparently our governor here, Jared Polis, is his imagination, but then he backtracked on that. But this really evil Venezuelan gang is trying to take over some of these apartment complexes. And, we thought MS-13 was bad enough, right? Well, these guys apparently are even worse. And they're known as the TDA, the Tren de Aragua. I don't really know how to say the last one. It's Spanish, but it has an interesting spelling. Anyway, Aragua. Now, they're a pretty well-organized and violent cartel. And when they're supplied into our country with new soldiers and new people to augment themselves, they see conquest as a viable option. It's hard to imagine in the United States, but it is. And they look at some of these apartment complexes, and I've seen this phenomenon, kind of up close. And also, I attended a seminar on it years ago about what's happening in some of the larger housing projects in like Chicago, St. Louis, places like that, which is very analogous to what happens here. And when you get a predominantly heavy amount of other immigrants living in these particular domiciles, then it's much easier. Just like the Tongs in San Francisco pretty much terrorized the Chinese community when they first started. This is what happens here. We'll be right back. All right, everybody, thanks for sticking around. It's Rick Wagner still here. I kind of got attenuated from the first segment there. We were speaking about how some of these cartel-type gangs can move into cities and take over buildings or even neighborhoods. And one of the ways that it happens is that, as I said, when some of these buildings become fully occupied or mostly occupied with immigrants or people who are of that heritage as these gang members are, or at least close to it, they come from the same part of the world, then they're the first people to be victimized, which is what really stinks about this. If you're a progressive and you think that, you're helping people, really you're bringing predators into the country, not just to terrorize, people in, outside of New York City, but also individuals that are pretty vulnerable here, because many of them do not have a choice about where they live. They don't have a lot of money, and so these types of apartment complexes are places they're pretty much stuck. And so by doing that, the gang members are able to run that building. And they can do all sorts of things. They can get people to assist them in their criminal activities. They usually start recruiting some of the young children that live in these apartment complexes. This is very common, particularly if you looked at like Cabrini Green and some of these other big ones like in Chicago and things like that, when they're the high-rises. They recognize that our juvenile justice system is such that by recruiting, 14-year-olds, 12 years old, whatever, to do some of their running, transfer drugs, things like that, that even if the child gets caught, the system is going to be so lenient on him that it's not something that the child's going to be particularly afraid of. I mean, a child in perhaps a suburban community that's never been in jail or seen anybody go to jail might be. But in these situations, unfortunately, they're exposed to all this stuff. And they make money. And it seems like easy money to them. You don't have a lot of life experience. It's pretty easy to be talked into some of these things. So they start recruiting them, and then they set up some of their operations in the apartments. And because they control the complex, the neighbors don't complain if they know it's good for them. Now, some of you saw the video that was shot in Aurora from a Ring camera on the door of one of the unfortunate people that lived in there, where there was 5 gang members came up with handguns, and one of them was talking on the phone. I wonder who he's talking to. And a long gun, an AR, oddly enough, with a scope on it, which is not really the setup of choice, using like room-sized behavior. But anyway, so they, pounded the lock off this door and went in. And it's unclear exactly what they're trying to do in the apartment across there, or what the beef might be, or if there even was a beef. But it was pretty frightening. And it shows what's happening. I mean, there's video evidence of it. And these people were finally able to move out. And I shared the video. My guess is that if they hadn't been able to get out of that complex, they wouldn't have shared the video, because they would become a target. I looked at the video from the owner of the apartment, one with the Ring camera, and they had 5 different locks on their front door that led out into the stairway area, which is an open stairway. In other words, it's open to the outside air, and it comes up 2 or 3 stories, probably 3 stories. And so they have 5 locks on there to try and keep this stuff down. Well, that's helpful, right? But many of you know that a door frame, particularly one that's not super well constructed like a lot of old apartment complexes, the door frame is what's anchoring those locks down. So at some point, it'll slow it down over just having, the knob turned on it, but it's not going to give you protection for very long against a, pretty much heavy force. Somebody's trying to get in. So it's a very frightening situation for these people. And because of that, and because of these folks' ability and readiness to use violence, they pretty much can cow the inhabitants there and create, like I say, a recruitment area, base of operations, control the neighborhood in some way, certainly control the near neighborhood. And as you might guess, it becomes not really good for some of the other neighboring buildings or neighborhoods. As I said, our governor here, Jared Polis, felt like we were just imagining that was a real problem, even in the face of the video. Of course, it's not. Everybody said it's not, and he's now changed his tune. But the fact that was his go-to from the beginning shows you kind of how he's approaching this problem. So I noticed that, a couple days ago, I guess it was almost 5 days ago now, they arrested in Aurora a potentially key figure in the Venezuelan gang. These big guys were operating out of Aurora, where this apartment complex was, but they weren't necessarily operating on that complex. And the officers had arrested, and this is interesting, I have a little trouble with this name, Jonardi Jose Pacheco Chirino. And they've arrested him twice. And that they say he is a documented member of this gang. Now, the Aurora Police said authorities are not aware of the status within the gang, likely reference to reports that Pacheco Chirino is also known as Cookie, is a ringleader or shot caller. They always like that sort of shot caller thing, calling the shots. And he is at this point now in the custody of U.S. Immigration and Customs because he's in the country illegally. Why is he still in the country illegally? I mean, did you notice that one part about there that he's been arrested before and he's back out again? Does that seem correct to you? This is what happens when you're sanctuary cities or when you're not cooperating with ICE. Of course, ICE has been so neutered by this administration that it's difficult for them to do anything. I mean, even in the days of George H.W. Bush and a few things like that, when the hands-off approach wasn't what was going on, it's still difficult to coordinate all this stuff, particularly if you're in a city far away from one of the bases for immigration naturalization, or ICE now. So it's not an easy job in the best of times. And when you're hampered by the fact that the local authorities are not allowed to work with you or contact you, even if they have someone they're pretty sure or know is not a citizen, who is that serving exactly? I've never heard an explanation of that. There's a lot of this stuff out there that the left wants that they don't discuss why they want it. Or they'll have something like, well, all illegal immigration is, these people are just trying to fend a better life. Okay, I understand that. But lowering the quality of life for the people already here, and in many instances, is probably not what we're looking for. You have to have a little control. And once you get a control of your borders, well, then you're not a country anymore. You're just a sack of money. And that's kind of what's happening. Certainly California's turning into that, or has turned into that. And here in Colorado, we're sort of like the little brother of California now. When California does something, the little brother looks up to it and goes, gosh, I wish I could do that, and he tries to mimic the older brother. We don't have as much money as California, but we have as many idiots. So, as a percentage, it appears. And I thought that was difficult given California's population. And so we're doing pretty much everything we can every legislative session to become more like them. The only thing, and I've said this many times before, that protects us from some of this is, one, the Western Slope's pretty conservative, and the local commissioners and some of the towns, not the one I live in, are fairly conservative as well. And so they're resistant to some of this stuff. And secondly is because of Tabor, the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights in Colorado, it's difficult for them to raise taxes all the time. Now, if you go back and look at what's going on in California and what's been going on for the last 20 years, there's taxes, fees, and everything else have been tacked on to an enormous percentage, which is how they were funding this ridiculous nonsense up until a couple of years ago. And now the bottom's fallen out. They went from having a substantial surplus to a frightening deficit, which is only going to increase probably this year and next. So if that's the direction we want to head, you would think that people in states like ours that are emulating them would say, ooh, I see where that road leads. But no. They want to see what they can be like their bigger brother. So we have to be constantly watchful for that. And the best thing you can do is work locally on this stuff, and don't let these characters get in any position of power in your community. And if there's a vote, vote. I can't tell you to vote for, but I wouldn't vote for these guys. And lots of times they arise in these areas where there's not a whole lot of competition for the job. They're on boards and things that either aren't paid or paid very little. and there's a lot of meeting time and so forth. And so people who have jobs and are earning a living and paying taxes and whatnot oftentimes shy away from them because it's a lot of headaches and it takes you away from the rest of your life. Well, in the meantime, a lot of these other characters that this is sort of what they do is get themselves into, not profits and this and that. And so this is kind of their job in some ways. So they get in there, and then, of course, what happens is that the effect they have on the working people who decided not to get involved, to not do these jobs, becomes substantial. And in very short order, the amount of money, time, and distress that the actions of these folks do in, at local government level far exceeds what the regular person who didn't do it because he had a job and didn't think it was something he had time for realizes that they're doing things to him all the time now that he doesn't have time for or money. So you have to look at that cost-benefit analysis. Oh, everybody, we're back. So we've been talking about a lot of sort of uplifting things like, the takeover of cities by Venezuelan drug gangs and, stuff like that. Make you feel pretty good about things. By the way, I was checking here, and it looks as though, it's very hard to get this number up there of people actually in the United States when we don't have any record of them coming in. We see them coming in, but we don't have a record of it because we're not doing anything at the border. But it looks to me like we're up to at least, I think this is a pretty safe number, probably 9 million. 9 to 10 million. That's a lot of folks. And what are they doing? Well, a variety of things, obviously. But it's interesting to see the group that is coming in. We've sort of stopped having individuals from Mexico per se, or refugees from the terrible conditions in Oaxaca. And instead now we're starting to get people from further south, obviously Venezuela, a little bit of Guatemala, so forth, and people who, interestingly enough, somehow managed to get to Mexico from Africa, the Middle East, China, places like that. Now, you may ask yourself, how do you get from those places to Mexico to walk in? It seems like you have to have some way to travel, right? I mean, it's not like you're just picking up from, your farm out there in southern Mexico and walking to the United States. No, it's this is a plan, and it takes place from other areas. That implies sort of that there's a network out there of people making money, feeding individuals across our borders. Hey, it is a lucrative business if you look into it. You get somebody who really is just asking for a ride to get somebody to the United States, and you charge them about $2,000-3,000. And these are not luxury accommodations, I might add. No, this is not like business class on Dubai Air. This is a little bit more like riding in a semi-truck trailer locked up for about 5 or 6 hours with no air conditioning. And that's if they decide to let you out before somebody forgets you're in there and things don't go very well. So it's not a barrel of monkeys for these people who are trying to get in, but it's lucrative for the others because really the danger is supposedly getting caught, and that doesn't seem to do much to people who get caught, smuggling folks in. I mean, like the worst thing I can tell is maybe they get arrested and something happens, so most of the time they're going to get, deported. And let's do it again. How many stories have you read about individuals who've committed some pretty heinous crimes that have been in and out of the country a few times? And that's just the record that we have of it. And considering we're keeping really lousy records, who knows? But there's money in that thing. So with money comes crime, right? When the source of the money is essentially illicit, right? Let's look at, say, Prohibition. Prohibition helped us create some of the most, intricate and profitable crime organizations the United States had seen up to then. Now, they sort of built it in for it because it was something that was already very popular. Matter of fact, drinking was, as you may know, is a pretty popular thing. Historically, it's been going on for a long time. Do we think that alcohol causes a lot of problems? Oh, yeah. Think that there's a noticeable percentage of people that have problems with alcohol addiction? Oh, yeah. we've been doing it since they began brewing mead in Central Europe, and probably before that someplace else. So it was kind of ingrained in culture. And yes, there's going to be a tremendous amount of people, in absolute numbers, that have a problem with this. Just like there's an absolute number of people that have trouble with marijuana or, say, gambling, things like that. But if you try and impose that restriction on everybody, most of whom don't have a problem, what's going to happen? Well, it's like Al Capone said. He's just giving the people what they want. Right? They were used to having it, and some people came along and took it away. So that makes for a very lucrative trade. Well, just ask the Kennedys. And so what happens is that people turn a blind eye to it in positions of power because they're getting kickbacks and so forth. But also, people are not crazy about the idea of stopping it because it's something they want. And that's why that amendment didn't work out. It was a little silly to think that you could impose something like that on a habit that people have been cultivating for 3,000 years or more. I'd have to go back and see when people first got drunk. I'm not exactly sure we have a good record of it. Drunk people in the Stone Age don't exactly leave a lot of signs around. But so everything you do that is illicit is a source of income for crime. We've been inviting that for a while with our drug policies and the idea that you can come in the country, you're technically breaking the law, but there's no consequence for you and very little consequence for the people that bring you in. So what do you think is going to happen? I mean, it's look at California. Like I said earlier in the show, Colorado, where I'm at, is like California's younger, dumber brother who thinks that their older brother can do no wrong. Now, that's not you and I, or most people live in Colorado, but it certainly is the sort of nimrods that want to go to the state legislature from the Front Range. And because they just do nothing but follow along, like I said, we don't have local politics anymore. We simply have national politics imposed at the local level. There's almost no difference, especially if you have progressives. They have the same ideas, the same solutions, same approach. They do in your town of 600 people, in most places anyway, many places, as they do in cities that have 6 million people. They think it's all the same. It's a really interesting concept. It's not exactly like government is able to sculpt itself to the arena that it's in. Remember, that was the whole point of federalism. We're supposed to be able to devolve power down. Well, really, you push power up, but it devolves down to be spread out into more and more disparate places. Everything was a little laboratory. And that's kind of what federalism is about, is we have the guardrails where we say these things are what people have and we don't want them infringed upon in our Constitution and some other founding documents. But the idea is that you guys just get out there and figure out all this other stuff. Because we think you'll do a better job of figuring it out than it being mandated by some state agency. The patent quote, I think I've said a couple of times, which is, let somebody give them a problem and see how they solve it. And you'll be amazed sometimes at how they come up with solutions. Now, that isn't always the case because some people, their whole life is making problems worse. But assuming you have some control over who you're giving it to, the more you try and impose your ideas on somebody to do something, the more restrictive it becomes. Now, then ends up being the kind of government you have. Now, we have a government that is increasingly becoming a top-down government. That's pretty obvious. I mean, even now, as we speak, the Biden-Harris administration is working feverishly to hire people into the career parts of the Department of Justice where you can't just be replaced by the president should Trump win, but they're protected by civil service. So they're trying to pump this thing full of, and this is not new. The Obamas did this too. Did a great job. If you look at just like the Biden administration, there were people who were really didn't appear to be very good at their jobs, but they were there the whole time. And why? Well, because they were establishing a sort of order within that agency, sort of a culture. And by establishing that culture, they sent the message to people that this is how you succeed in this organization. These are the things that you have to be important in your life, have important in your life, and manifest them at work, and then you'll be rewarded. If you don't manifest these, or Lord forbid, you argue with them, well, welcome to sweeping up out in the garage. Maybe it's your own home without a job, but you're not going to be able to survive in the corporate culture that is trying to signal all this stuff. We see it in the military. I mean, I talk about this all the time. You guys know this just as well. If you look at the military organization and our accomplishments, and I'd put air quotes around those, this last 20 years, there's not much there. We have managed to lose a lot of engagements. I wouldn't exactly say we lose wars per se. I mean, Vietnam, you can call it a loss, but it was really just an untenable stalemate. And then everybody knew that when we got out of there, that was going to be it. Korea was a, quote, police action, and we're still dealing with the fallout from that. But you know what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan? Our initial impulses were very well executed. I'm not even sure we could get to that now. We don't have any Schwarzkopfs, people like that, to execute the invasion, as it were. Now, of course, we lost the peace, as the left likes to say. In other words, we could take something, but we couldn't manage it. And that's interesting. And it's a good lesson. We've seen it several times in history, but people don't seem to learn it. So you have to kind of decide, is there a way we can stop this nonsense? I get that a lot. And I would have to say, no. No, we can't really stop it, because it's just another turn of the great cosmic wheel. And we can't do much with that. It just marches on, rolls on, however you want to see it. But what we can do is we can work to dictate, to some extent, the direction it goes. We can't stop the wheel, but sometimes we can steer it. That requires a lot more subtlety than just saying no, because sooner or later, no doesn't work. People forget why they wanted something, and they easily forget why you're saying no. They just think you're mean. So we have to try and steer this thing. Remember, if you think about how this whole system can collapse down, and I'm not suggesting it's going to right away. I put the caveat on there right away. But you see how these things go. And we like to use Rome as an example because it's so full of history, lasted so long, had so many different challenges, that some of which it overcame, some of which it did not, that we have it's chock full of lessons. But remember that the idea of leadership that we have in this country is pretty new. It feels old to us because we have a little history here. In the scheme of history, not so much. And so the idea that this is a successful experiment in the long view of human government since the beginning, it's just a blip. We don't know for sure. And when things turn sour, and they do every once in a while. Now, we talk about our fourth turning here, about how this generational thing seems to come up every fourth generation, where they get progressively further away from their values, have less and less understanding about how they got to their standard of living and what they're doing in their life, and begin to decide that they should do everything different or differently. And that makes society turn at some point. Yeah, well, we get that. And you can see it. I mean, we all see it generationally. The Zoomers right now, Generation Z, before 2012 and I think 1997, something like that, those people have a completely different approach to things than we do as slightly older folks. They are having problems with integration into society. Now, they had the pandemic. That's true. That was not good for them. People growing up and trying to socialize themselves. By that I mean try and make themselves part of a community, a civilization. That was sort of stopped. That was bad news. You had to stay back in your house there, unless you were important enough, like Gavin Newsom, and you could go to the French Laundry and have a nice dinner. But most of us couldn't. So that stifled their social interaction. There's no question, if you ask employers who is the most difficult generation to work with in the workplace, they will almost always say the Zoomers. Not because they don't like them, but because their skill sets are so weird. They also have been taught that they are fantastic. They're just great at it. They're just great. Yet their skill sets are so low, which means that they can take no criticism. So in the workplace, you get directed sometimes by doing things wrong, and your boss or whomever you're answering to corrects you and says, that was wrong, no, do it this way, learn from that, do it the other way. Well, that sounds like you're saying that I'm not perfect, that I made a mistake. We all know that doesn't happen. My mom said that doesn't happen, that I never make mistakes. I'm just wonderful. We have a lot of that. Also, because they haven't spent a lot of time interacting with people outside their households, and this is exacerbated by these screens. And you don't have to leave the house to entertain yourself anymore. Now, like I said, if your parents can send you to your bedroom to think about what you did, and in 1965 it was pretty boring up there. Maybe you could read some comic books or something like that. But now, unless they specifically take away your electronics, who knows what you're doing up there? How you're being amused. You're not amusing yourself. That's the other thing I hear. People say, well, they're amusing themselves, but no, they're not. They're using the techniques and the technology to amuse them, which means the technology, companies like TikTok and so forth, are leading the way. They're not being used. It's not like someone's going out in the garage and getting a croquet set and setting it up. Right? You go about that. You're kind of in charge of how that works. Right? When you set it up, when you take it down, how it's played. You go online anymore? No. You pretty much conform to its rules. This makes a whole generation that lives like that weirdly conformist within certain topics. We have to learn how to get around that. So I don't think we can stop the wheel of time here that's churning away. But as we can try and steer it. This has always been what's happened. Sometimes it goes the wrong direction. People don't understand what's happening. Let's think about feudalism for a little bit. I know I like to talk about the descent into the Dark Ages. And, of course, a lot of historians now like saying, it wasn't so dark. Yeah, it depends on when you talk about it. Now, if you're talking about, say, I don't know, 800 to maybe 1270, something like that, pretty long time, yeah, things didn't change a whole lot. They're not particularly pleasant for the average person to be hanging out. Luckily, they didn't hang out very long because there were so many different ways to kill them. Either infections, disease, plagues, accidents. Accidents happened to a lot of people in the Middle Ages that they couldn't figure out how to help them, repair them. There was a big problem with sepsis. We didn't call it that. Sepsis has been around in so many different ways. The Greeks used to call it Apollo's arrows. The Norse would say that you were elf shot. When you got this disease that came in, most of the time it came in from being wounded or cutting yourself when you're working or something like that. Took out a lot of people. Dysentery took out an enormous amount of people. So it wasn't exactly a bouncy house in terms of living, and also not much progress is being made. You didn't see a whole lot of difference between somebody wandering around in, say, 1100 and someone wandering around in 1200. Certainly not from 1000 to 1100, something like that. That seems so short when we say it. It's a really long time when you're living it. And it collapsed because the system that had maintained individuals, some individual rights, a way of living, and so forth, even when they were attenuated under the Caesars, the bad ones, there was still the idea that individuals possessed a certain right. As a citizen of the Roman Empire, you had a right to certain procedures before things could happen to you. Now, a lot of times those were perverted, just like we see in our system, but it was at least there. As all that collapsed, because they didn't take care of their great civilization, they thought it would last forever without doing anything. when all that collapsed, it all shifted. Feudalism, which is a really wide open definition that we use for that period of time, and it really had many manifestations, but went the other way. It became towards concentrations of power away from the individual and into a class. Now, for some time, it was a noble class that, was led by the most powerful noble. We call him a king, whatever you say. And then at some points it became where the king just had all the power. It just devolved into that for various reasons. But what it is that the difference, and this is the way we are here, what became apparent in that way of approaching governing is that what you have and what you're permitted to do and sort of the natural things in your life you're supposed to be able to do, they come from above. And I don't mean the Lord. I mean the king or the Duke of, the Duke of Earl, perhaps. The person who's ruling over you. They decide what your rights are. You don't have any mutable rights, really. I mean, even in the Magna Carta, which started changing these kinds of things, it was mainly for the nobles, but it helped everybody a little bit. So this idea of top-down government is not old. I mean, it's not new. It's very old. And it happens when things start going to pieces. Somebody seizes power. They have the ability to enforce or through violence or whatever the case may be over people, and then they decide what the people are going to do. And we say, well, yeah, of course that's what happens. But think about our system. Our system, our Constitution, and our founding documents, what lies at the center of them is that we have natural rights that all men do just by being on the earth. And that our government, its first job is to protect those rights. That's why I always say when someone's telling you, well, the Constitution gives me the right to. No, the Constitution doesn't give you the right to. The Constitution keeps the government off your back while you're exercising your God-given rights. That's what it does. This is why Obama called it negative liberties, which is a weird way to put it. I'm not even sure that's not some sort of paradoxical phrase. But yeah, I mean, it denies government power in certain areas, which lets you exercise your rights. And over time, it feels like that somehow your rights are being awarded to you, but they're not. So if you don't exercise them, voting, going to part of a bill of assembly, things like this, then they'll start getting consumed by a more consolidation of power. This is a lesson of history. So when we come into this next election, which is coming up pretty fast, it's a choice between being governed and having our rights protected. That's kind of the choice.
Thanks for listening. Listen, if you'd like to listen to more and you want to maybe perhaps have someone else listen to our podcast, you can do so either by going right to our webpage, politicalviking.com, or therickWagnerShow.com. Both of them take you there. You can get links right directly to our podcast, or you can hear our podcast on Podbean, on iTunes, and Spotify, and a couple others. So you can find us. We appreciate it if you do. And if you've heard the show, you want somebody else to hear it, that's a good way to send it to them. Thanks for listening.